I didn't understand the meaning of a silence that stings until the day the airplane cabin went quiet in a way that felt older than the sky itself. The kind of quiet that tells you something has already changed before you realize it has. The kind that lingers in your bones long after the noise returns. In those moments before everything began, the light over seat 12F flickered like a heartbeat trying to decide whether to keep going. And I remember thinking that some seats carry more weight than they appear to, almost like they remember who sits in them. If this feeling settles into your chest the way it did into mine, if you believe that people deserve to be seen before they're judged, then go ahead and like and subscribe now. Because this story is about exactly that. About how one row of metal and fabric became a battlefield of assumptions, pride, and hidden truth. The boarding line had felt longer than my life had been heavy, snaking through Phoenix Sky Harbor in a slow-moving ribbon of rolling suitcases, coffee cups, impatient sighs, and polished shoes that clicked sharply against the tile. And I had walked in the middle of it with my backpack strapped too tight across my shoulders. My daughter Rosie balanced on my hip like she had grown there. Her tiny fingers tangled in the collar of my worn work shirt, as if she were afraid I might disappear if she let go. I could smell jet fuel through the sliding glass doors, a sharp, metallic scent that always reminded me of leaving something behind. And the announcement board blinked our flight number in bright orange letters that felt almost accusatory, as though the plane itself knew how much was riding on this trip. Rosie, just barely 3, kept resting her forehead against my shoulder, her breath warm against my neck, and every time she did, I felt the knot in my chest tighten. Because this flight wasn't a vacation or a business trip, it was a gamble on hope, a last-chance journey to a specialist in Seattle who might finally help her hear clearly again after months of tests, consultations, and bills that stacked up like bricks around my heart. When we finally reached the gate, I saw her first, the woman who would sit beside me without knowing she was about to become part of my story. Tall, poised, impossibly polished, her blonde hair pinned back so perfectly that even the airport air seemed afraid to disturb it. A tailored blazer hugging her shoulders like armor, diamond studs catching the fluorescent lights and flashes that made me blink. She carried herself the way people do when they're used to moving through the world without resistance, like doors open simply because she walks toward them, and the sleek black suitcase rolling at her side looked heavier with status than with clothes. The gate agent practically straightened when she approached, addressing her as Miss Korda, and I caught the name on her boarding pass in passing. Lena Korda, CEO of Korda Aerospace, before she slipped it into her leather tote. When boarding began, I shuffled forward with the rest of Group 7, feeling smaller with every step, aware of the scuffs on my boots, the faint grease stain on my sleeve I hadn't noticed until now, and the way Rosie clutched her battered stuffed rabbit as if it were a lifeline. Inside the plane, the aisle felt narrower than usual, lined with passengers who turned just enough to take me in, some with curiosity, others with indifference, and a few with that quick, assessing glance that decides your worth in half a second. I found 12F, the dreaded middle seat, wedged between the window and aisle, with barely enough space for my knees, and I shifted awkwardly as I settled Rosie onto my lap, whispering that we'd be okay even as sweat gathered beneath my collar. The smell of recycled air mixed with faint perfume from the row ahead, something floral and expensive that made my nose itch, and as I buckled in, I heard heels click down the aisle behind me. Then she appeared beside me, Lena Korda herself, sliding into the aisle seat with a precision that suggested she was used to first class, not cramped economy, her eyes flicking briefly over me and lingering just long enough for me to feel the judgment settle. She barely glanced at Rosie before her lips curved in what might have been a polite smile, but felt more like a polished dismissal. And when she tried to stow her carry-on, it took both of us to wedge it into the overhead bin that clearly wasn't built for corporate life. As the cabin filled, the hum of conversation wrapped around us like background noise, and Rosie fidgeted, tapping her small foot against the seat in front of us while I whispered that we'd take off soon. Lena crossed her legs with effortless grace, smoothing her blazer, and when Rosie let out a small whimper, she exhaled sharply through her nose, the sound carrying irritation thinly veiled. "Is she really going to cry the whole flight?" she asked, her voice smooth but edged with impatience, and I felt heat rise to my face as I apologized, rocking Rosie gently. promising her snacks and cartoons once the plane leveled out. The truth was, Rosie cried more lately, not because she was spoiled, but because the world sounded muffled to her, because doctors' offices had become her playground, because needles and scans had replaced birthday parties and playdates. Lena turned to her tablet instead, scrolling through emails that flashed with bold headlines and financial jargon I could barely comprehend, her manicured fingers moving quickly across the screen while I stared at the torn seam in the seat back pocket in front of me. When the flight attendants demonstrated the safety procedures, Rosie pressed her face into my chest, and I felt Lena's gaze flick toward us again, this time with something colder, as though our presence inconvenienced her more than a delayed flight ever could. I tried to imagine her world, boardrooms, private jets, glossy skyscrapers, but in that moment, it felt impossibly distant, like a movie I was watching from the wrong side of the screen. As we taxied down the runway, I squeezed Rosie a little tighter, whispering that the noise would be loud but safe, and when the engines roared to life, the vibration traveled through my bones, rattling loose every worry I'd been holding together. Once we were airborne, the cabin loosened, seat belts clicked open, and the scent of coffee drifted down the aisle, mingling with the hum of engines that seemed to steady my breathing. Lena immediately reclined her seat without so much as a glance behind her, pinning my knees painfully, and when I tapped her shoulder to ask if she could move it forward just a bit, she sighed like I'd interrupted something important. "This is already uncomfortable enough," she said coolly, adjusting it by a mere inch before turning away again. I stared out the window at the patchwork of desert shrinking beneath us, thinking about the small apartment we'd left behind, the empty chair where my wife used to sit, and the stack of medical bills waiting on the kitchen counter like silent threats. Rosie eventually drifted to sleep against me, her breath soft and uneven, and for a few minutes, I allowed myself to believe that maybe this trip would be different, that maybe hope wasn't a cruel trick after all. But then Lena leaned toward me again, her perfume washing over me like a wave, and her voice carried a sharper edge. "You know, most parents plan flights around nap time," she murmured, as if my daughter were a scheduling inconvenience rather than a human being. I swallowed hard, biting back the words that wanted to spill out, and simply nodded, too tired to argue, too aware of how small my life must have looked from her seat. Around us, the cabin settled into that strange midair calm where strangers pretend not to exist, lost in movies, emails, or half-hearted conversations. Yet beneath it all, I felt the tension humming between Lena and me like a stretched wire. She laughed softly at something on her screen, a bright, practiced sound that didn't quite reach her eyes, and I wondered what kind of world allowed someone to glide through it so effortlessly while others clung on by their fingernails. Every time Rosie shifted in my arms, I felt Lena stiffen, as though our very presence disturbed the order she expected, and I kept thinking about how easily people categorize one another. Rich or poor, important or invisible, problem or solution. By the time the drink cart rolled past, my legs were numb, my heart heavy, and my mind racing with calculations about specialists, travel costs, and how many shifts I'd need to pick up when we returned. Lena accepted her sparkling water with a gracious smile, thanking the flight attendant by name, while I politely declined anything, knowing every dollar mattered more than thirst. As the plane cruised at 37,000 feet, I studied the cloudless sky outside, trying to imagine a future where Rosie could hear laughter clearly again, where she could run towards sound instead of shrinking from it. Beside me, Lena typed furiously, the click of her tablet a rhythmic reminder of the life she led. Meetings, mergers, decisions that moved millions, while I sat clutching a child whose entire world depended on my next few choices. In that moment, I didn't know that this cramped seat, this flickering light, and this woman beside me would soon collide in a way that would unravel everything we thought we knew about each other. All I knew was that I felt small, judged, and trapped in a middle seat that seemed to carry more weight than any first-class throne, and as Rosie slept against my chest, I silently promised her that no matter how invisible the world tried to make us feel, I would fight to make her heard. The moment the cabin changed felt less like a sudden shock and more like the slow tipping of a world you didn't realize had been leaning the wrong way all along. The engines still humming steadily, while something invisible in the air tightened, a pressure that made the hairs along my arms stand up before my mind could catch up to what my body already sensed. Rosie stirred in my lap, her small fingers curling into my shirt as a sharp crash of sound ripped through the aisle. Metal striking metal, a tray table slamming, then a woman's scream that cut cleanly through the airplane's white noise. I remember the light above us flickering again, weaker this time, as if even it hesitated, and in that half-second I saw Lena's polished calm fracture. Her tablet slipped from her hands and slid to the floor with a hollow clatter while her eyes snapped toward the front of the cabin. Ahead of us, a man had collapsed sideways into the aisle, his coffee spilling across the carpet like dark ink while his chest hitched in uneven, desperate breaths, and the murmurs that had filled the plane dissolved into panicked whispers. A flight attendant rushed past, voice tight but trained, calling for medical assistance, asking if any doctors were on board, and the words barely reached me before my body moved on instinct. I shifted Rosie gently into Lena's arms before I could think twice, surprising both of us, and for a heartbeat Lena just stared at me, frozen, as if she couldn't comprehend why I trusted her with my child. "Hold her," I said quickly, already unbuckling, and she nodded without speaking, her perfectly manicured hands suddenly trembling as they wrapped around Rosie. The aisle felt impossibly long as I pushed past startled passengers, knees brushing armrests, elbows knocking seatbacks, but training carried me forward the way muscle memory always does when chaos arrives. I dropped to the floor beside the man just as another attendant knelt opposite me, her face pale but determined, and I saw instantly that this wasn't simple fainting. His skin was gray, his pulse racing beneath my fingers like a trapped bird. Years of drills, deployments, and split-second decisions flooded back into my mind with terrifying clarity. I cleared his airway, checked for breathing, positioned his head, and began compressions with a steady rhythm that drowned out everything else, even the pounding of my own heart. Around me, voices blurred together, questions about diverting, frightened children crying, passengers filming with their phones, but I locked my focus on the man's chest rising and falling beneath my hands, counting breaths, measuring time in compressions instead of seconds. From somewhere behind me, I heard Rosie start to whimper, a thin, uncertain sound that sliced straight through my concentration, and I forced myself not to turn around, not to look at her in Lena's arms, because if I did I might falter. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calm but edged with urgency, informing the cabin that we had a trained responder assisting and asking everyone to remain seated. Yet still the air felt electric, charged with fear. Sweat dripped down my temple as I continued compressions, feeling the man's ribs flex beneath my palms, praying silently that my hands were enough, that all those hours of training would matter here, at 37,000 feet over empty sky. Then, just as my arms began to burn, I felt it, the faint return of resistance, a shuddering inhale that wasn't mine, and the man coughed violently, choking before his breathing steadied into something recognizable. Relief washed over me, so suddenly my vision blurred. But I didn't stop working. I rolled him onto his side, monitored his pulse, and signaled to the attendant that he was stabilizing. Only then did I glance back toward 12F, and what I saw made my breath hitch. Lena still cradled Rosie against her chest, her composure shattered, tears streaking her face as she rocked my daughter gently, whispering soothing nonsense into her hair. Our eyes met across the aisle, and in that moment I saw something entirely different in her gaze. Not disdain, not irritation, but raw recognition, as if she were seeing me for the first time. By the time paramedics were requested and the captain announced an emergency landing, the worst had passed, and I stepped back to let the crew take over, my hands slick with sweat, my shirt wrinkled and damp. Applause rippled through the cabin, tentative at first, then swelling into something overwhelming that made my ears ring, yet I barely heard it. All I could think about was Rosie, reaching for her as soon as I returned to my seat. Lena handed her back without hesitation, murmuring, "She's safe," in a voice stripped of its earlier edge, and when Rosie buried her face in my neck, I felt my chest loosen for the first time since boarding. The plane landed hard but controlled, and as we taxied toward the gate, the captain's voice filled the cabin again, this time carrying a gravity that silenced even the lingering whispers. He asked everyone to remain seated for a special announcement, and I felt Lena stiffen beside me, her attention fixed forward. Then he called out my name, Evan Porter in seat 12F, and for a moment I thought I'd misheard, my pulse jumping with confusion as passengers turned in their seats to look at me. Would you please stand? The captain continued, his tone respectful in a way I'd never heard directed at someone in economy, and with Rosie still in my arms I rose slowly, unsure what was happening, suddenly aware of every stain on my shirt, every scuff on my boots. The captain's next words landed like thunder. Stand so this entire aircraft can salute you. In an instant, every single person around me was on their feet, first class, business, economy, flight attendants, even the pilots visible through the cockpit door, and the sight made my throat close up. Lena was the last to rise, her earlier coolness gone, replaced by something softer, humbler, as she looked at me with tears shining again in her eyes. The applause returned, louder this time, shaking the cabin. But beneath it I heard only my own breathing and Rosie's small voice murmuring, "Daddy, okay," into my shoulder. As we deplaned, Lena pressed her business card into my hand, her fingers warm against mine, and though she spoke quietly, her words carried a weight that made my heart pound. She wanted to help, she said, not out of charity but out of obligation, because today had changed how she saw the world. I tucked the card into my pocket, still dazed, as airport lights glared around us and paramedics wheeled the passenger past, alive and breathing. In that corridor between plane and terminal, surrounded by strangers who now felt oddly familiar, I realized that the narrow aisle, the flickering light, and even the terrible middle seat had become something far larger than I ever could have imagined. A turning point I didn't see coming, a collision of two lives that would not simply drift apart again once we reached the ground. The airport felt different when we stepped into it after the salute, brighter in a way that had nothing to do with the lights and everything to do with the way the world had tilted beneath my feet, as if I'd crossed an invisible threshold between being unseen and finally being recognized. Rosie clung to me, her small hand fisted in my collar while she watched the paramedics wheel the man away, sirens already echoing faintly beyond the sliding doors, and I could feel her heartbeat against my chest like a steady reminder of why every decision in my life mattered. Lena walked beside us through the terminal, no longer a distant executive surrounded by assistants, but a woman moving quietly, thoughtfully, her heels softer against the floor, her gaze resting on Rosie with an unfamiliar tenderness that made my throat tighten. When we reached baggage claim, she stopped, turned toward me, and pressed her card into my palm again, this time holding my eyes until I truly understood that she meant what she said, that help was coming, that doors were opening, that my daughter would not have to fight alone anymore. I didn't thank her in a polished way. My voice cracked, my words stumbled, but she only nodded, as if she understood that gratitude sometimes sounds messy. As she walked away, disappearing into a line of waiting drivers and sleek black cars, I looked down at Rosie sleeping against me and felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years: quiet, steady hope. Outside, planes took off into a pale sky, engines roaring toward places unknown, and I realized that this journey, the cramped seat, the flickering light, the emergency, the salute, had been less about a flight and more about being seen for who I truly was. I walked toward the exit with my daughter in my arms, knowing our road ahead would still be hard, but carrying a new certainty that sometimes the world shifts not through power or money, but through one human being choosing to act when everyone else stayed seated, and another choosing to change when it would have been easier not to.